Good morning and welcome to Sophy Ridge on Sunday. Hello, I'm Trevor Phillips, sitting in for Sophie, who's away. Well, he marched them up to the top of the hill and he marched them down again. But this morning, Yevgeny Prigozhin is off to Belarus, probably with pockets stuffed with Moscow gold, having humiliated the Russian president. Yesterday, Vladimir Putin called his former ally a criminal traitor and promised to crush the rebellion. This morning, the mercenary leader received a pardon, even before there's been a trial. Maybe Mr. Putin should have paid more attention to Hillary Clinton, who once rather wisely said, "You can't keep snakes in your backyard and expect them only to bite your neighbours." Back home, who's up and who's down? Well, there's no sign of the Labour Party's political advance slowing. They think they're up. The Conservative government seems helpless in the face of stubborn inflation. So most people reckon they're down. North of the border, there's chaos in the ranks of the Scottish National Party over their finances. But the nation's still split over independence. So maybe the SNP is neither up nor down? Well, in the next 60 minutes, we'll try to work out who's right and who's wrong. I'll speak to the First Minister of Scotland and leader of the embattled SNP, Humza Yousaf. For the government here in Westminster, I'll be joined by the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, John Glen. And for Labour, the Shadow Levelling Up Secretary, Lisa Nandy. After that extraordinary 24 hours in Russia, we'll try to work out what it means for the conflict in Ukraine with the former head of the British Army, General Lord Dannatt. And we'll have expert analysis from former British intelligence officers Christopher Steele and Philip Ingram. Plus, we'll have a live update from Moscow with our very own Diana Magnay. Well, plenty of important domestic matters to talk about today, not least, of course, the economy and inflation, which we'll get to shortly. But let's start this morning with some immediate live reaction to the events in Russia from the government. I'm joined now by the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, that's John Glen. Good morning, Mr. Glen.
Good morning, Trevor.
Now, the Government Emergency Response Committee, COBRA, met yesterday.
Yes.
What is the government's understanding of the situation in Russia this morning?
Well, you're right, COBRA was convened, chaired by the Foreign Secretary. This is fundamentally an internal matter for Russia. Obviously, observing it, it is obviously a very unstable situation in Russia, but it is fundamentally an internal matter. And we've obviously urged, alongside our allies, which conversations have been had over the last 24 hours, that obviously civilian interests are considered, and they seem to have done that. But this isn't a matter that we would be intervening in, but obviously we observe and monitor the situation on an ongoing basis very carefully.
Well, look, I know that the diplomatic language is it's an internal matter, not for us to comment on and all the rest of it. But doesn't this alter the equation in Ukraine, where we have invested billions and where we have an interest?
Well, we as a government have been committed from the start on supporting Ukraine in their battle against what Putin has done, and we will continue to remain focused on that. We continue to train troops, support with military support, and we're united with our allies in leading in that effort. That will continue. That is a separate matter to what's happening in Russia over the last couple of days.
Did I hear you say we've sent troops to the Ukraine?
We've been training troops. I visited them in Salisbury Plain just this week.
OK. So this involves no interruption or indeed no escalation of our effort, because there are some people who would now say that actually this might mean an escalation by the Russians in their assault on Ukraine. The Wagner mercenaries are now, we understand, being integrated with Russian troops. So might this be the moment for a bit more support for Mr. Zelensky and his team?
Well, we will work very closely with Ukraine as the situation's evolved and as it has evolved over recent months. And that is our primary focus, supporting Ukraine deal with Putin in whatever form that attack takes, and it has evolved over recent months. So nothing has changed with respect to the British government's position in supporting Ukraine. I obviously recognise these are concerning events of what's happened in Russia, but as I said, we will remain very close to our allies. Cobra has evaluated, alongside our allies, what has been happening and urged concerns of civilians to be taken into account. But this isn't something that we would intervene in. It's an internal matter for Russia.
All right, well, let's talk about the things that are internal to us under your control. The economy. Let's start with that. Inflation in this country is running much higher than in comparable countries. We compare, for example, with the Eurozone and the Americans. The Americans down there at 4%. But it's not actually just the level, but the fact that the Americans' inflation is down a bit, the Eurozone is down a bit, ours is stuck at 8.7%. Now, we know the Bank of England has got its one club, interest rates. They've put on 50 basis points this week. Let's talk about what the government can do. Give me one thing that you, in the Treasury, are doing to tackle this inflation.
Well, as Chief Secretary to the Treasury, my responsibility fundamentally and primarily is to control public spending. And that is an incredibly challenging job at this time because obviously we had a 3-year comprehensive spending review 2 years back. And obviously these inflationary pressures bear down across all our public expenditure, on capital spending and on day-to-day expenditure. But keeping a grip on public spending, making tough decisions on reprioritisation, putting an efficiency and savings review into the preparation for the last fiscal event, the last budget. And you will know, obviously, that the Chancellor asked me to lead a productivity review, which I'm now undergoing, and that will happen over the next few months, looking at how we can control public spending at a very difficult time as we still deal with many legacies from COVID.
All very sensible, but explain to me how any of that has any bearing on that 8.7% figure in the next few months, which is when it's hurting.
Well, I can understand, and I really do understand, because I obviously have constituents who email me, are concerned about the implications of higher interest rates for their household budgets. But there isn't a single quick lever that I can give you a soundbite on.
I'm just asking you for one contribution.
Well, I think there are 3 elements to the government's response. The independent monetary policy interest rates, which you've described, controlling public expenditure, and then helping with those additional costs. So we've helped with those energy bills, and we extended that in the spring budget. But I would just want
to... Yeah, but the energy bills are coming down anyway. The big thing here is mortgages, isn't it?
Can I just point out that I think by putting one screenshot on your screen, you failed to show the fact that the interest rate pressures across Europe and across many of our allies, Australia, Canada, US interest rates have gone up the fastest rate since the 1980s. Yeah. This is a common experience. Now, you're obviously rightly asking me what's happening in the UK, and I'm telling you that. But what I am saying to you is there isn't one single thing I can do sat in Whitehall that's going to resolve this in 1 month.
OK, fair enough. But I did make the point that actually the problem for us is that ours is stuck where others are going down. Let's interrogate some of those things.
Please.
Let's start with the Bank of England, by the way, where you don't have control over what the Bank of England does.
No.
But you do have control over who is running the Bank of England. And your Transport Secretary colleague, Grant Shapps, told my colleague Sophy Ridge, Mark Harper, I beg your pardon, told my colleague Sophy Ridge earlier on this week that he thought that the bank had been too slow.
Well, we remain in the Treasury completely aligned to the bank. They, as you say, have responsibility for interest rate policy. They've had that for over 25 years. And if you look at it over those 25 years, they've been pretty effective in keeping it to the 2% inflation target. These are incredibly difficult times, and they have made their decision. The MPC committee made that decision last week, and we work closely with them in lockstep with them. They are independent of us, so they make those judgments, and you wouldn't expect me to comment on that.
Yeah, they're independent of you, but you appoint the head. So from what you said, Andrew Bailey's safe in his job for the time being.
Well, he had an 8-year term. I think he was appointed at the end of 2019. I worked very closely with Andrew in a previous job when he was head of the FCA, and we support him in taking the decisions necessary.
Right, so no P45 in sight for Mr Bailey. Can we deal with one other thing where there are a lot of noises off? Can we stop talking about tax cuts now? That's not going to happen, is it?
Well, you know that we never talk about measures before fiscal events. Obviously, the headroom that we had at previous fiscal event in the spring is now in a different state because of the interest rate payments that we have to pay. Now, basically, we shut down the economy. We spent a lot of money. When we came out of COVID, we had a lot of debt interest to pay. That has gone up because interest rates have gone up, and that makes our public finances very challenging. Two significant, once in 100 years and once in several generation events of war in Europe. The government is here to deal with whatever circumstances are happening, and we are taking the right decisions at a difficult time, as the IMF indeed endorsed in their recent assessment of the UK economy.
I'm taking that as an answer that tax cuts are not on your agenda.
I think the Prime Minister's made very clear, the Chancellor made very clear, that our priority is halving inflation. That's the dominant threat to the UK economy, and that's what we're most focused on at this time.
All right, let's deal with something that is absolutely in your control. One thing that wouldn't help inflation is a big increase in energy bills. And Telegraph is reporting that the £170 a year green levies that were temporarily removed are going to come back onto bills next month. Is that true?
Well, we're making assessments all the time of how we can deal with the challenges of supply across the economy and the different input costs. I can't confirm that this morning, but we are looking carefully at everything. The Chancellor will be meeting with regulators next week. And we met with the FCA and bank lenders, for example, on Friday to deal with the pressures that households are facing with their mortgages. And we will continue to do everything we can across all departments of government.
So I'm taking it, no decision's been taken, but the restoration of that levy is on the table.
Well, in the sense that when governments are facing really challenging times, all decisions are looked at in terms of what we can do to make the situation better whilst continuing to recognise that halving inflation has to remain our priority. That's the lens that the government is consistently and unitedly focusing on.
OK, one way in which you could make life easy for yourself is if banks were to pass on the rate rises to savers in the way that the mortgage increases are passed on to mortgage holders. Rachel Reeves has written to the Chancellor saying that there should be action from him and regulators to make sure that savers benefit from the change in interest rates. Good idea or not?
Well, I recognise the concern that exists. The Chancellor himself has recognised that this is something that we're monitoring very carefully. He's met with the FCA and the banks on Friday. The primary focus was dealing with the implications of the higher interest rates in that conversation. And several positive things came out of that in terms of the opportunity to go to interest only for 6 months, to have conversations with your lender and not prejudice your credit rating, as well as delaying repossession from the first time you miss a payment. That was a constructive set of conversations, and we'll continue to look at the gap, if you like, between the interest on savings and the headline rates.
All right, well, look, let's talk about something that's in your personal purview, and that is, you've mentioned it already, public sector pay. Now, if you want to keep public expenditure down, a big chunk of that is pay. The Times is reporting that the Prime Minister is going to overrule the independent pay review bodies and block the recommendations for the next round of pay sector awards of around 6%, 6.5%. Is that right?
No, what happens is we have the reports of the pay review bodies. Most of those have come in, and then we look at those and make an assessment. Now, obviously, in some of the disputes we've had in recent months, they're near to resolution. We've obviously very pleased that Several of the NHS unions have agreed the agenda for change deal, 5% and then 4%, and some different changes across working practices. And we will look at those pay review body reports, and that will be the Prime Minister and the Chancellor working together with input from me on what the right way of resolving this is.
OK, let's just get this clear, though. You guys have been saying for the best part of a year, when there were strikes, wait for pay review body, we will support what the independent pay review body says, we have to accept what the pay review bodies say. Are you now telling me that actually it's not quite that, we are going to look at what the pay review bodies say and we may accept it?
No, what we're saying is that we haven't had all the pay review body reports.
No, but as a matter
yet.
of principle.
As a matter of principle, pay review bodies are a very significant part of resolving the pay issues. But obviously, we've also got to take account of the effect on inflation. That would be irresponsible not to do that. So we haven't finished that process, Trevor.
Forgive me if I bang on about this, because last time I was sitting here, I can't remember which of your colleagues who was saying this to me. Pay review body, got to go with pay review. And that was when, actually, the pay review was recommending something lower than what the unions wanted, and it was all fine then, in principle, to support the pay review body. What you're telling me this morning is, it's just one factor. We've got to think about other things.
No, what I've tried...
Is that other pay review bodies' recommendations only sacrosanct when they benefit you guys?
No, what I'm trying to tell you is that I can't give you the conclusion of the pay review body review process.
I wasn't asking you for that.
Can I answer? I can't give you that yet because we haven't finished that analysis. But what I'm saying to you is at the same time as we're looking at that, we're also aware of the implications for inflation. And that is critical and the Prime Minister's top priority, as set out at the start of the year and as he'll be saying in interviews today. OK, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be rude, but it's just that the last time I spoke to one of your colleagues, they weren't waiting for the pay review bodies to report. They simply said, we'll accept what they're going to report. But as you can see, with some of these pay review bodies and the implications and the distribution between a non-con payment and the whether you do it over 1 year or 2 years, these are factors that are relevant. It's not quite as straightforward as that.
OK, your colleague Gillian Keegan over at Education says that big pay rises for teachers would be inflationary. And I'm quoting her here. Our ongoing strikes, to quote language from an earlier era perhaps, ongoing strikes, a price worth paying to keep pay and inflation down.
I don't think anyone wants to see strikes across any of our public services. I understand what leads to that situation, but what the government's got to do is take responsible decisions on public spending in the round. Pay is a significant element of that, and obviously I'm very aware of the massive contribution that teachers, nurses and public sector workers make, and we have got to get the right outcomes that are fair to them but also aren't inflationary. And as you put up on that initial slide at the start of our conversation this morning, inflation is going to be tough to get down. It's something that we're focused on and we are united and determined to do so.
John Glen, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you, Trevor.
It has, by any estimation, been an extraordinary last 24 hours in Russia, watched with bated breath around the world. It seemed at one point that the Putin regime stood on the brink, with a column of military vehicles heading to Moscow. The leader of the rebels, Yevgeny Prigozhin of the mercenary group Wagner, has now done a deal to leave for Belarus. The rebellion began early yesterday morning in Rostov-on-Don, when forces of the Wagner Group occupied the headquarters for Russia's military operations in Ukraine. They then seized control of military facilities in Voronezh, about 500 kilometres south of Moscow. A mercenary convoy then advanced north of Voronezh along the M4 motorway towards Moscow. Russian forces then erected defensive positions and blockaded main roads and bridges along the route before the order was given for the mercenaries to stand down. Well, let's get the very latest now from our Moscow correspondent, Diana Magne, who is live in the Russian capital. Good morning, Diana. What is the mood in Moscow and what is the military situation as you understand it?
Well, I mean, it's a sunny morning in Moscow, and I think people yesterday were watching events with a degree of confusion, and I think in Moscow especially, now they have a day off tomorrow, so they're probably just enjoying this peaceful resolution. And I think, though, there will be a lot of people who are questioning what on earth actually happened. And given the shadow it sort of casts over Putin's authority, over his credibility, you know, bear in mind the fact that early yesterday morning he went on television and made a big speech talking about how this was treasonous, a stab in the heart of the Russian people, essentially, and only a few hours later backtracked and let Prigozhin slink off to Belarus, where he is either en route or already in situ. It doesn't look very good for Vladimir Putin. I think there are a lot of questions being asked as to why on earth, Prigozhin, who is entirely a man of the Kremlin's own making. All of his projects over the last 10 years have been for serving the Kremlin's purposes. Why Putin has constructed a system of the power vertical where he can't get Shoigu, Gerasimov and Prigozhin sitting around a table with the commander-in-chief and hash out the problems all in one room together. Why it has to come to this kind of a breaking point is entirely Putin's fault, because he just likes to keep these different factions sort of at arm's length. Prigozhin doesn't really have a direct line to Vladimir Putin. That's why he likes to shout and rave on social media all the time. So, you know, this was a very strange situation, but frankly, given the amount of noise that Prigozhin has been making over the past 3 or 4 months, you know, one would have been foolish to think that it couldn't have got this far. But I think the fact that there are so many question marks over how quickly it's resolved does beg a lot of questions. You know, now, if Prigozhin is given power and authority to do what he wants in Belarus, that is actually going to be extremely uncomfortable for the West, for Ukraine, for the Belarusian people. You know, Lukashenko is rumoured to be fairly ill. He's been in Moscow quite a lot recently. I'm sure that the Kremlin is looking around for a substitute for him, or for someone who can exert power in Belarus. And if Prigozhin is still somebody who does heed the words of Vladimir Putin, then he would be placed there. We understand from Prigozhin that he has been offered governorships here in Russia before and has refused them. This would be quite a good substitute. Now, if that was part of the plan, then why did Putin come out and make this speech and end up looking so bad yesterday? You know, I don't have the answers to this kind of thing. But the outcome, if Prigozhin ends up being a powerful man for Russia in Belarus against Ukraine, against the West, well, that suits Putin's purposes. You know, but we don't know essentially what happened. We don't know the state of the military. Perhaps Prigozhin just recognised after he made his announcement and after that column came up towards Moscow that he simply didn't have the kind of backing within the military or within the security services that he might have hoped for, and that people weren't turning to him. So, I mean, it's really difficult to know. But I think, yeah.
Sorry, Diana, that's absolutely fascinating. So is it your estimation that Prigozhin actually, rather than sort of riding off into the sunset, is actually going to be a factor, or could actually now be a factor, in the Ukraine war?
Well, I mean, he has been a considerable factor in the Ukraine war, hasn't he, because of his Wagner mercenaries. If he's positioned in Belarus, if Wagner takes more of a role in Belarus, if he's given power in Belarus, which is essentially up to Vladimir Putin rather than Alexander Lukashenko, then Belarus comes even more under the remit of Putin. But it just depends if he's allowed to take on that kind of power in Belarus or not. And then if you have Wagner mercenaries sitting in Belarus, there are already lots of Russian military bases there. That, in effect, gives more of a pincer movement around Ukraine. So I'm speculating here, but we'll have to see how much authority he's allowed to wield, or if he's just sort of essentially relegated there and sits in exile, as is the way it's being cast in some circles now. But if he is still Putin's man, he could be useful for him there.
Diana, thank you. We'll keep looking out for your fascinating analysis on this as the days go by. Thank you very much. Well, let's get the view from the opposition, and I can now speak to the Shadow Levelling Up Secretary, Lisa Nandy. Good morning. Good morning,
Hi, good
Lisa.
morning, Trevor.
You used to be Shadow Foreign Secretary. What should the current Foreign Secretary and the rest of the government be saying and doing about this situation in Russia and Belarus now?
Well, I think largely, actually, unusually perhaps for a politician, I think they should be doing pretty much what they are. I think they should be mindful of the fact that there's a major impact on Russian civilians of the events of the last 36 hours, that this is an enormously volatile situation. It's very difficult to predict what it means for Russia in particular, but what it does do is expose the fragility of the Russian government. And it's clear that Ukraine is winning the war. We now need to make sure that all of the NATO allies stand not just with President Zelensky and Ukraine to send a clear message to President Putin that we will be there and with the Ukrainian people until that war is won, but also to show a completely united front against a splintering set of Russian forces. The phone call between the UK, the US, France and Germany was extremely welcome. We need to see more of that cooperation and us standing together in support of Ukraine and against the actions of President Putin.
OK, let's see if we can keep this outbreak of harmony going when we turn to domestic matters. You asked the government to agree a series of things with the banks to deal with the rising mortgage rate. And by my reckoning, actually, they've done most of them. One cheer for the Chancellor?
Well, the key is whether these measures are mandatory or not, and we understand that they're not. We estimate that significant numbers of people won't be able to access any support at all unless the measures become mandatory, so that all mortgage payers, not just some, have access to these measures that give them more flexibility to extend mortgage terms, to be able to shift from one type of mortgage to another. We want clarity about whether there'll be any fees or tariffs attached to changing the terms of your mortgage. We want to ensure that it won't affect people's credit rating if they take up these offers. These are all questions that the Chancellor has to be able to answer if people are to be confident that there is help coming now and they'll be able to stay in their homes. But more importantly, for far too long, even before the Tories crashed the economy and sent mortgages through the roof, we've had an affordability crisis in this country. The reason that people are feeling a lot more pain now than they were in the 90s is because the average buyer in the 90s was borrowing 3 or 4 times their annual salary. Now they're borrowing around 11 times of their annual salary. There is no answer to this crisis without building more homes, and that's exactly what Labour will do.
Well, everybody wants to build more homes, but let's just deal for the moment, if we can, with what's going to happen in the next few months. Whether it's mandatory or not, all of these measures are, to some extent, about making a bad situation not so bad, so people don't lose their homes and so on. But what can you do about the root cause here, which is inflation? I asked John Glen what policy he would have to make things different right now. What would Labour do? Give me one thing that Labour would do to affect inflation right now.
Well, one of the measures that we're pushing the government to take on today is the fact that banks have passed on interest rates rises to mortgage payers, but they haven't passed on those same interest rate rises to savers. If you make it more attractive for people to save, then it does have a significant effect in cooling inflation. So there are good reasons why the government ought to be intervening to ensure that banks pass on those interest rate rises to savers as well, and we're asking the government to do that today.
Forgive me for interrupting you, but how does putting more money in the pockets of savers reduce inflation? Actually, traditionally, orthodox economics says it would do exactly the opposite.
Well, what we're proposing is that the government ensures that those rises are passed on so that it's more attractive for people to put money into savings in order to help cool the economy. It can't be right that banks are passing on interest rate rises to mortgage payers and not to savers. We think that's a sensible and proportionate thing for the government to be doing. Ultimately, there are a number of ways in which any responsible government should be seeking to tackle the inflation crisis, but we think that one of the ways that we can get out of this mess is to get the economy growing. And, you know, forgive me, but you said that there's obviously everybody wants to build more houses, but the government has just abolished local housing targets, which has sent house building off a cliff, projected to fall to its lowest level in a generation. And the House Builders Federation projects that that will have a £17 billion cost to the economy. The only route out of this crisis in the end is to bring some calm and stability to the markets and to start getting the economy growing in every part of Britain. And that's what Labour proposes to do.
But forgive me, if I may just take you back to the policy that you're espousing today, which is to put more money in the pockets of savers. And actually, by your own figures, I was looking at the release that you put out today, somebody'd have to have £10,000 in savings to get an extra 50 quid a year from what you're proposing. How is that going to affect inflation?
Because it makes it more attractive for people to put money into their savings account rather than
the effect of 50 quid a year
in the economy.
If anybody's got 10,000 to keep in a savings bank, I mean, the effect will be marginal, wouldn't it?
Sure, but what you're looking at when you're looking at an inflation crisis of this magnitude is a number of multifaceted ways in which any government has to tackle it. That's what the Chancellor says that he's doing. We're proposing constructive ways in which he can help to ease the burden and ease the pain for people right now, and one of those ways is just to ensure basic fairness in the way that the banking industry is operating. If they're passing on interest rate rises to mortgage payers, they should be passing them on to savers as well, and we think that would have perhaps a small effect, but a significant effect put together with other measures in order to cool inflation and try and take the heat out of the economy.
All right. The Chief Secretary of the Treasury wouldn't commit to implementing the recommendations of the independent pay review bodies, 6%, 6.5% for teachers and other public sectors workers. Would Labour commit to implementing the recommendations of the pay review bodies?
Well, we haven't seen them, and we will obviously take them seriously. Pay review bodies are instructed by the government to look at a range of factors. They take evidence from interested parties and then they make recommendations accordingly, so they deserve to be taken seriously. But it's worth noting that we are not in government. We haven't been allowed access to the accounts. So we don't know what the situation is, and ultimately it is for governments to decide whether to accept those recommendations or not. If we were in government right now, we would be asking the pay review bodies to give far more weight to the recruitment and retention crisis in the recommendations that we make. We take seriously their recommendations, but we wouldn't be bound for them. Ultimately, we'd be seeking a far more constructive relationship with our trade unions and our frontline workforce so that we could negotiate our way through what is a very, very difficult situation, not just in addressing the issues around pay for frontline workers, but also addressing the issues around working conditions. In the NHS, for example, it's one of the major challenges and one of the major reasons that people tell us that they're leaving is because they just cannot see light at the end of the tunnel. They're so overworked, as well as struggling to put food on the table.
You're in the same place as government is on that question. Let's have a look at a couple of the specific disputes. The railway workers, the RMT, want 8.7%. You sympathetic? Would you? I understand you'd be negotiating and so on, but would you be negotiating around that 8.7% figure?
Well, of course, we've been negotiating around the requests that they've made and what is ultimately affordable and sustainable. We won't make promises that we can't keep, but asking me to conduct a negotiation live on air and make a decision about that when I haven't seen the books would be a bit like asking me to advise somebody how much more they could afford to pay on their mortgage at the moment without having seen their bank account. It's just not something that an opposition can or should responsibly be doing. But I will challenge you on one thing. We certainly wouldn't be taking the approach that this government has been taking. Even today, we've had the Education Secretary out attacking our frontline teaching workforce for the actions that they're taking without any acknowledgement that the government has caused absolute havoc in the education system over the last 13 years, but particularly over the last few years during COVID, when they chopped and changed their rules and regulations at the whim of their backbenchers, and it's children and young people who've paid the price.
Forgive me for interrupting you, but I can't let you go without asking you about this question. Political correspondents are reporting that several female Labour MPs have expressed concern that all the Labour candidates for the upcoming by-elections are white males. Does that bother you?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's something that we take very seriously in the Labour Party. I myself was selected on an all-women shortlist. People say now I would have been selected anyway, but the truth is that until and unless we change the perception of what a Member of Parliament looks like, that wasn't going to change. We've reached the threshold with the being allowed to use all women shortlists again, but for me and others across the Labour Party, it's incumbent on us to go out and make the case for why we need more women and more diversity in Parliament, and particularly at local level. If we're going to affect the biggest transfer of power out of Westminster and Whitehall in modern British history, which we are, we need to make sure that our mayors and our council leaders and our cabinet members are representative of the communities they serve, and we're absolutely committed to doing that.
Lisa Nandy, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
OK, let's focus again on Russia and try to work out what the events of the last 24 hours might mean for the conflict in Ukraine. Joining me now is the former Chief of General Staff, General Lord Richard Dannatt. Good morning, General Richard.
Good morning. Good to join you.
Thank you very much for joining us. What do you make, first of all, of the Wagner Group's withdrawal and the way that might affect the military balance in Ukraine?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that after yesterday's fiasco, I think there are no winners. Putin is definitely much diminished. The Russian military, and this is of significance as far as Ukraine is concerned, is clearly in some disarray. And Prigozhin, well, apparently he's left the stage to go to Belarus, but is that the end of Prigozhin and the Wagner Group? The fact that he's gone to Belarus is, I think, a matter of some concern. Now, what we don't know, but we'll discover in the next hours and days, is whether how many of his fighters have actually gone with him. Because if he has gone to Belarus and has kept an effective fighting force around him, then he then presents a threat again to the Ukrainian flank closest to Kyiv, which was where all this began on the 24th of February last year. So although it would appear that this matter is closed, I think it's far from closed, and the aftershocks of yesterday will reverberate for quite some time.
If you were in command in Kyiv, what would you be worried about now? The progress of your counter-offensive to the east, or would you be worried about, as you've just been saying, a potential threat from the north in Belarus?
I would certainly want to make sure that I've got good observation to the north on the axis down from Belarus towards Kyiv. The Russians have exploited that in the past quite disastrously, but it's quite possible that they might do so again, led by Prigozhin and whatever troops he's got. Now, as I said just now, we don't know what troops he has got at his disposal, but they need to watch that flank very carefully and make sure that they have got some maneuver units such that they could repel a renewed attack from the direction of Belarus. Meanwhile, I think that there is every reason to continue, for the Ukrainians to continue their probing attacks along the Russian defensive line, trying to find those weak spots or weaker spots into which they could deploy their 10 to 12 attack brigades of highly trained Western equipped soldiers to endeavor to create something of a break-in and a breakthrough. And this, if they think they've found a spot or one or two locations to do that, then to consider making that attack sooner rather than later, while the Russians themselves are in some disarray. So this is a moment of opportunity for the Ukrainians. But as we've seen over the last 2 or 3 weeks, they're being sensibly cautious and will not commit their most valuable reserve troops, their attack brigades, until they are sure that they found a weak spot and could make a decisive attack. And that's the right thing for them to try and do.
Without deeper intelligence, I guess, nobody can say for certain, but you've been in these situations many, many times. And I wonder what you estimate the impact of this has been or will be on the Russian forces, because it's been, widely accepted that the Wagner Group were, I think the word that people have been used, battle-hardened. They've been amongst the most effective forces that the Russians have at their disposal. It's not entirely clear, as you say, what they're going to be doing now, but from your estimation, does this weaken Putin's military capability, or potentially does it strengthen it?
I think the short answer to that question is that it weakens it. I think what we have seen demonstrated over the last 48 hours is disarray in the upper echelons of the Russian command and control system. It may well be that the casualty out of all this is Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, and it may well be that the Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, who is the operational commander in Ukraine, it may be that his position is weakened. I think the other factor to bear in mind is that although that the Russians have had quite some time over this winter and spring to prepare their defensive lines, they are manned in the main with soldiers who are poorly trained, poorly equipped and poorly led, many of whom don't want to be there, many of whom were not in the military a year or so ago. So I think the Ukrainians, I'm sure, have got uppermost in their mind is that the morale of their opponents, the average Russian soldier, is pretty low. And that's why if they can find some points of weakness along the Russian defensive lines and exploit those with 1 or 2 decisive blows, it could have a disproportionate effect in shattering the morale and the backbone of the Russian army and produce some quite significant success. Now, I don't know if that's going to happen. I would like to think that it might, but all these factors together, Ukraine remains in a strong position against an enemy, albeit in prepared defensive positions, with low morale and a disjointed command and control structure at the present moment, whose political leader undoubtedly has been wounded by events in the past. Yes, there is the Prigozhin card, and as I said a few minutes ago, I think we've got to watch very carefully to see what Prigozhin and his Wagner troops do, and there is a possible threat that they might pose from Belarus to Kyiv, and if I was the Ukrainian commander-in-chief, I would watch that front very carefully.
General Richard, thank you so much for your time and also for your wisdom this morning.
Thank you very much.
Right, let's go to the domestic front now and the political situation in Scotland. Yesterday, the First Minister, Humza Yousaf, had to stop a speech following a very loud intervention from a heckler at a special conference meant to set out how the SNP would plot a path to independence. Well, heckling is probably the least of his worries, with the party still mired in chaos following financial scandals and arrests, including that of his predecessor, Nicola Sturgeon. Oh, and the polls are looking pretty grim for the party that has dominated Scottish politics for so long. Well, I'm joined now by the First Minister, Humza Yousaf. Good morning, Mr. Yousaf. Joining us from Dundee.
And just as per your introduction, it's probably worth me saying that in virtually every single poll that has come out, of course, we still continue to be the party that leads every single other party in Scotland. But I just thought I'd just throw that in there, given your very kind introduction of me.
Well, kind of you to fill us in on that, but we'll come back to that in a second. You said yesterday that you would make the next general election a referendum on independence. Does that mean that, as your predecessor clarified, that if you got 50% of the vote, you would consider that a mandate for independence? But would it also mean that if you didn't get 50%, you just drop it?
First of all, it's not what I said, so I'll clarify in a second. It's worth reminding people that, of course, our preferred option, the option for which we have multiple mandates for, the option which the majority of the Scottish Parliament backs, is, of course, for that legally binding referendum. Now, that has been denied time and time again by the UK government. So my message is pretty simple. We will use the next general election to test the proposition. We'll put a very simple proposition to the people of Scotland on page 1, line 1 of our manifesto. A vote for the SNP is a vote for Scotland to become an independent country. Now, if we win that general election, we'll then seek to negotiate with the UK government how we give democratic effect to that proposition. And we're only going down this route, of course, because I continue to reiterate, because the UK government, Westminster parties continue to deny us the right to a referendum.
But so forgive me for interrupting you. When you say if we win that general election, what does that constitute? Does that mean most seats in Scotland? Does that mean 50% of the vote? What does winning the general election mean?
Sure, I'm happy. I'm happy to clarify, but I suspect you have covered more general elections than I have even been involved in campaigning. In every single general election, everybody knows the rules of a general election. The party that wins the most seats wins the general election. So again, if you want to test a proposition for popular support, which is a fair enough ask to do, in fact, it's what we want to do. If you want to test a proposition for popular support, you do that via referendum. That's no different to any democratic country in the world that wants to test a proposition for popular support. But the rules of a general election are thus that, of course, the party that wins the most seats wins that general election.
OK, so if you win more seats than anybody else, you are going to take that as a mandate to push for a further referendum. Now, both Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer have said it doesn't really matter what comes out, you're not getting one. What are you going to do to force their hands? And by the way,
well, first and
it's perfectly
foremost,
legal for them to say that.
Well, first and foremost, I would put it to Keir Starmer, to Rishi Sunak, very simply. You continue to tell Scotland that this is a voluntary union, then prove it. If you're saying that you can't have your independence via referendum, I'm afraid we will not accept any mandate that's given to you via a general election. This is a voluntary union. How on earth does Scotland become independent? But the question you ask is a very fair one, and the second part of my speech, in fact, one of the main arguments that I was making to our activists and reminding our activist base of, is that it's so important for us to ensure that we have a consistent majority supporting independence. So while, of course, we'll be campaigning in that general election, what we're doing right now is campaigning to make sure that we have that settled will, that consistent majority in Scotland that support independence, because it is the power of the people that I don't doubt will break Westminster's intransigence.
Oh, if I can just get clear something here. I mean, we're talking about democracy. If there's a general election and either Mr Sunak or Sir Keir Starmer are in Downing Street, they will have gone to the country with a manifesto that says we are not going to have another referendum. They will have won. In what way is it not democratic for them to fulfil their mandate given to them by a general election of the United Kingdom? Scotland's not independent yet.
Well, there's two points to make on that. Of course, if we beat Labour in Scotland, then of course we win the general election here in Scotland. If you are saying that Scotland can continue to be denied a referendum because they are outvoted by the fact that the rest of the UK have more seats, then I would say to you very gently that that is the democratic deficit which we are continuing to rail against, I'm afraid, because there is a deficit in that regard. So you are essentially saying unless the rest of the UK allows you to become independent, allows you to have a referendum, and that's the only way you can become independent. That, to me, doesn't sound like a voluntary union at all.
OK. All right. Well, look, we could go on about that, but let's go on to the circumstances in which you govern. Perhaps the best way of persuading everybody that Scotland should be independent would be to have a brilliant performance by the SNP government in Scotland. So let's address a couple of issues which don't depend on Westminster's say-so for agreement. For example, the NHS. You were responsible for it in Scotland between May 21 and March 1923. Now, the number of patients on waiting list in Scotland is up to 780,000. There are over 18,000 people who died waiting for treatment, a rise of 39% compared with 2019. It's not a stellar record, is it?
Your suggestion that somehow that is unique to Scotland, it would frankly
I'm
be
not
absurd.
suggesting it's unique. I'm just saying it's not very good for Scotland.
Well, it's the proposition that is the premise that underlines your question. That would be absurd, of course, because a global pandemic, by its definition, has affected health services right across the world. The pandemic was the biggest shock that hit our NHS in its almost 75-year existence. In terms of the NHS here in Scotland, we stand on a record that shows that Scotland's A&E departments are the best performing for well over 7 years. In fact, in the winter that's just passed, there was only one nation in the UK that didn't lose a single day to strikes in the NHS. That was Scotland, of course, while I was Health Secretary. And when it comes to those longest waits on the NHS, if you look at those people who've been waiting for over 2 years, we've made dramatic reductions when it's inpatients, outpatients, or indeed for those that are waiting for diagnostic tests. So there are challenges with the NHS. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but that's undoubtedly been exacerbated by that global pandemic. But we're absolutely focused on making sure that we can recover our NHS and social care. And just on that point, you say it's not connected to anything that Westminster does. Well, we all know that you don't recover your NHS without recovering your social care. One of the biggest challenges we have, of course, has been Brexit. If you ask anybody involved in social care, they will tell you how much of the workforce in social care we've lost because of that hard Brexit, which Scotland didn't vote for.
We're wandering a bit away from your government's performance. It's still not better. It's not really.
I'm sorry. I just don't agree. If you want to talk about the SNP's record, of course, there's a report out 2 weeks ago showing that because of our actions, an estimated 90,000 children will be lifted out of poverty. If you want to look at our record, an Ernst & Young report out just last week shows that Scotland outpaces the rest of the UK and Europe when it comes to foreign direct investment. You want to talk about our record, you've got the best performing A&E departments in the entire UK. If you want to talk about our record, we have more young people going to university from deprived areas in Scotland than ever before. I can go on and on and on if you want, but ultimately it is the verdict of the people, and they keep trusting the SNP
Nobody would
in
say
government.
that you are responsible for some of the, let's call them shenanigans that have taken place in the party, but you have inherited a situation which has damaged the SNP. Can I just get clear one thing? Are there any circumstances in which you would remove the whip from the MSP and former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon?
I'm not going to get hypotheticals about what might happen in a live police investigation. You should know better than that, of course, that it's inappropriate for ministers, First Ministers, any elected politician to, of course, comment on what is a live police investigation. Of course,
I'm just asking if you can imagine...
I've made it...
I'm not asking you what
circumstances I've made it very, very,
I'm just
very
asking
clear.
if you can imagine circumstances in which she would lose the whip.
Again, I'm not going to make this about either Nicola Sturgeon or anybody else, but what I will say is those that have been released without charge have been consistent. They have not had the whip removed for them or their party membership suspended. We'll keep that situation under review, but it is a live police investigation and one that I'm not keen to comment on for that very reason.
You do accept, though, don't you, that this has been pretty catastrophic for your party. You're the chief executive of the party, arrested in April, missing 30,000 members, the purchase of a luxury motorhome worth £110,000. Did you know any of that when you stood for the leadership?
No, and I made that clear at the time. And look, I'm not going to argue with your central proposition. I mean, it's probably been the most difficult few months of the party's recent modern history. But I'm the leader and I've got to make sure I do everything I can to ensure that there's stability within the party, that we are open and transparent. That's why I instructed a governance and financial oversight, financial review as well. So the party is conducting that at the moment. But it's also why it's important for me to galvanise our party, and that's why we had such a great convention here in the city of Dundee just yesterday. So despite all those challenges, it's worth me reiterating what I did at the very opening of the interview. We are still the most popular party in Scotland in virtually every single poll, and of course we have by far the most members than any other political party here in Scotland. So that's a pretty good base to build upon.
I just want to give you the opportunity to respond to what I think some people say, you've been a very senior member of the SNP government for a long time, best part of a decade. It is hard to understand that you would not have any consciousness of any of these issues until after you became elected as the party's leader. You can understand why that seems bizarre to an outsider.
Not really, because nobody's really asked that question before, because people generally tend to understand that you can be a senior member of the government. That doesn't mean you're a senior member necessarily of the party, because I've actually never had an office-bearing position in the party, and for almost 20 years that I've been involved in the party, I've had a number of pretty tricky jobs that have kept me busy in government, whether it was Transport Minister, Justice Secretary, or indeed Health Secretary, as you just alluded to a moment ago. So, I'll be up front. You asked me a pretty straight question. Did I know about the various different issues that you raised before they were made public in the media? No. The answer to that very simply is no.
All right, one other thing which has caused you quite a lot of trouble. I know that the Parliament has passed the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, but it is an extremely unpopular bill, according to polls in Scotland. Barely 1 in 5 people support it. Labour has said it won't support it. Tories have said they won't support it. Are you going to continue pushing for that through legal action in the courts?
Well, first of all, let me correct your assertion again, and this is really basic, actually, that, of course, the Labour Party did support the Gender Reform Recognition Bill, as did the Liberal Democrats, as did the Greens, as did the SNP, and indeed some members of the Conservative parties. We had members of every single party supporting the Gender Recognition Reform Bill. Actually, this is a pretty simple issue of democracy. Whether you agree with the substance of the GRR bill or not, we have a bill that's been passed by the majority of Parliament that is within our devolved competency, which has then been vetoed by a UK government. That, to me, is another example of a Westminster government that's looking and seeking to undermine devolution time and time again.
All right, forgive me, I'm just interrupting you because something has just landed, which I just want to ask you about. It's breaking news. Scotland Fire and Rescue is saying that alongside other services across the UK, the national 999 system is experiencing technical problems and they're urging people to phone other numbers. Your reaction, how worrying is that as somebody who's been responsible for one of those emergency services in health and so on?
That is, of course, concerning, and we're, of course, working with Scottish Fire and Rescue and others to see if that situation can be resolved. As you know, the UK works right across the UK on that 999 airwaves system, so any problems will, of course, work and collaborate with partners right across the UK in that regard. But, of course, the situation, as you've expressed it, is one of concern.
First Minister, thank you very much for your time this morning. It's been good to talk to you.
Thank you.
OK, a little later, after past, I'll be on The Take, our chance to discuss this morning's interviews and try to work out what we've learned. This morning, I'm going to be joined by Claire Ellicott from the Mail on Sunday, their acting deputy political editor, and Peter Walker, who is also the acting deputy political editor for The Guardian. And they're with me now for a quick word. You've been watching. What stood out for you, Claire?
Well, I think the most pressing issue is obviously Russia, but I think John Glen's comments on mortgages, the situation, the economic situation at the moment, that's what's really people are really concerned about. And he didn't really say much, did he? We didn't really get a lot out of him. We don't really know what the government's going to be doing about any of this. Obviously, Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, he's hauled in the banks, he's going to be hauling in the regulators, speaking to supermarkets about costs. But really, it does feel like there's not a lot the government can actually do to reassure people who really will be worrying about their mortgages at the moment.
Peter, were you shocked and surprised by anything you heard?
I noticed, I mean, you very much picked this up, but when John Glen was talking about the public sector pay, you were making the point that if this Sunday Times story is right and they turn down what the pay review bodies do say, I mean, we all know that it's not a mandatory process, it's a recommendation, so the government's always been able to say, yes, we will, or yes, we won't. But they've made a bit of a bind for themselves with these previous strikes. They said, oh, no, we can't possibly give any more because this is what the public sector body says. And they've kind of boxed themselves into a corner now because these bodies, which they've been talking up for months and months, might now give a figure that they don't like. And they're going to have to say, actually, no, it was just a recommended one. So I think that's politically quite interesting. They've created a bit of a problem for themselves there.
Indeed. All right, we're going to talk more. Before we do move on to the take, let's return to that story which has, of course, dominated the weekend's news. Events in Russia and the abortive coup that seemed to have been launched and then walked back by the now exiled mercenary leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin. And I'm going to get some expert analysis from former British intelligence officer Christopher Steele and the former British military intelligence officer Philip Ingram. Good morning, Christopher. Good morning, Philip.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Christopher, what do you make of where we've got to this morning? It seems, was it all a lot of fuss about nothing, or has something changed?
No, I think something has changed, and what's changed, I think, is that Vladimir Putin has lost authority and legitimacy within Russia and has been challenged in a way. Yes, he's managed to worm his way out of it for the present. But to see events unfold in Russia yesterday and the speed with which the situation seemed to spiral out of control must be very concerning for Putin and the people around him.
So what do you think? Is the takeaway here that Putin is weaker than he was on Thursday?
Well, I think that's one of the takeaways, definitely. But the other bit that's there is there's an awful lot we don't know yet. Prigozhin won't have done this in isolation. He's achieved an awful lot. He's driven hundreds of kilometres in less than 24 hours when it took him 18 months to fight through 7 kilometres inside Ukraine. He has embarrassed Shoigu by getting a military capability that was under Russian MOD command, allegedly, and taking it out and taking it into Russia, capturing one of Russia's largest cities bloodlessly, and then driving towards Moscow and threatening the whole regime. There's a lot more to play out with this.
Well, let's assess who has most to worry about. Let's put Putin to one side for a moment. But it sounds like we haven't heard anything from Shoigu or Gerasimov, the military leaders. Does anybody think that they have essentially been taken out of the picture, Christopher?
It's too early to say yet, but my strong feeling would be that Shoigu is finished. Whether Gerasimov survives is another matter. Of course, Putin doesn't want to be seen to look weak by getting rid of them in the immediate aftermath of this debacle, and it may take a few weeks to play out, but my guess would be that Shoigu won't be defence minister for that much longer.
And I'm really asking about this because in the end, the big thing here, Philip, is what will it mean for the war in Ukraine? Does this give the Ukrainians a little bit of an edge, or is it something that makes no difference? Or, as Diana Magne was suggesting earlier on, that actually it means that there's somebody competent and dangerous in Belarus now who will add strength to Putin's hand?
Well, the answer is yes to all of those. In reality, from a tactical perspective, is it affecting the Ukrainian counteroffensive and the Russian defence on the ground? Not really. The Russian soldiers that are on the ground are too interested in protecting their own lives and saving their own lives. The Ukrainians are still having to fight through minefields that are still there, tank traps that are still there, defensive lines that are still there. However, where it does start to help is when it comes to the wider coordination that there is in the support that's going into Ukraine and the ability to plan forward. Because the Russian military approach is a very top-down approach. Orders come from the very top and are executed at the lowest levels. There's no initiative within that whatsoever. So there's creating confusion in there. And the Ukrainians have got an opportunity here. They can add more confusion at an operational level by destroying other command and control headquarters, logistics hubs, lines of communication, which will cause the higher command, who are confused by everything that's going on, an even bigger headache. That gives them a real opportunity that they can exploit tactically on the ground. But it will take a few days or a week or so for that to properly come through. So we are in early days at the moment.
Christopher, let me ask you finally the usual unfair TV journalist's question. Look forward a year. Will Putin still be there? And looking closer in the horizon, What can we do in this country or in the West to make sure that that balance tips in the way that the Ukrainians want?
I think it's important to say, first of all, that we shouldn't be interfering in Russian internal politics with a view to toppling a regime. However, obviously, we want the Russians to withdraw from Ukraine and to become a more responsible state. I think the main thing we can do is try and ensure Ukrainian victory on the battlefield, because I think that is where this whole thing will be decided in the end.
Thank you both for your commentary. We don't know what's going to happen, but no doubt we'll be on it all the time. That's it for this week's Sophy Ridge on Sunday. In a moment, after the break, we'll run through today's interviews and see what we learn in The Take. Thanks for joining us this Sunday morning. Welcome back. This is Sophy Ridge on Sunday. The Take, a chance to look back at our interviews this morning on the programme and try to work out what we've learned and what it means for the week ahead. Well, with me are Claire Ellicott, the Mail on Sunday's acting deputy political editor, and Peter Walker, acting deputy political editor for The Guardian. Now, I asked the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, John Glen, whether the instability thrown up by the rebellion on Russia should make the West look again at how it supports Ukraine.
So nothing has changed with respect to the British government's position in supporting Ukraine. I obviously recognise these are concerning events of what's happened in Russia, but as I said, we will remain very close to our allies. Cobra has evaluated alongside our allies what has been happening. and urged concerns of civilians to be taken into account. But this isn't something that we would intervene in. It's an internal matter for Russia.
Claire, that's a rather distinctly hands-off approach, isn't it? I was a bit surprised by that.
Well, I think that the Western governments are very keen to not give Putin any ammunition to say that they're getting at all involved in domestic affairs in Russia. And it would suit the Western governments as well to just keep well out of this, because whatever happens in Russia, it looks like Putin's been dealt a blow and his authority has been weakened. And if you sit on the sidelines and wait to see what unfolds, that's got to be a better position than getting involved and saying anything. So I think they'll continue with this. But it remains to be seen how much Putin has been weakened by this. We've got the Wagner boss. He's now in Belarus. Seems like he's exiled from Russia. But it was extraordinary yesterday watching what happened. I mean, we don't know what went on, and it doesn't really make sense. So I think there'll be far more to learn about what's happened in this crisis. But either way, it's got to be a sort of good thing for Ukraine and for the West that Russia does look like it's in peril in a way it hasn't done for a long time.
You agree, Peter? And if you do, what should we be doing? Steady she goes, or ramp up the support?
I mean, I think Claire is completely right in the sense that there's a vested interest for the UK to not want to get involved in the internal affairs of Russia, because that's a completely different thing. And to even give this intimation of wanting Putin to go would give ammunition for the Kremlin to kind of say, the UK is very much taking a side on this. But more than that, there's not actually that much we can do. I mean, I get the sense that in government yesterday, they were on a kind of higher level scale to all of us punters were watching it on Twitter and watching it on live blogs and just not knowing what was going to come next. And obviously their intelligence sources are better, but they were basically doing the same thing. They were watching this convoy advance down the motorway, turn around and go back. And, people in Russia didn't know what was going to take place. There was probably a dozen people in the entire world who knew what might take place next. So there was almost little that they could do except watch. And, I think be careful to not hope for too much too quickly, because, revolutions, as everyone knows, can go all sorts of very unexpected ways.
It's weird, isn't it? It's a sort of an attempted coup, blink, and you missed it.
Yeah.
Let's hear what Labour's shadow levelling up secretary, Lisa Nandy, had to say. She hinted that, in her view, the government is pretty much getting it right so far in its response to the Russia rebellion.
Unusually, perhaps, for a politician, I think they should be doing pretty much what they are. I think they should be mindful of the fact that there's a major impact on Russian civilians of the events of the last 36 hours, that this is an enormously volatile situation. It's very difficult to predict what it means for Russia in particular, but what it does do is expose the fragility of the Russian government, and it's clear that Ukraine is winning the war.
Peter, this, of course, is a television political interviewer's nightmare. the shadow levelling up secretary and the cabinet secretary completely agree. Annoying as hell. But are there any political opportunities here for the opposition to exploit?
I genuinely don't think there are, except to try and look as kind of statesman and stateswoman-like as they can. Because I think the UK would have taken this very pro-Ukraine role anyway, but Boris Johnson, when the invasion took place, was very keen to try and position the UK from a PR front, as very much we're pro-Ukraine, try and help them as much as we can. And that's proved to be a very electorally popular thing. And, again, I think Labour would have almost certainly taken the same thing. But, for a political interviewer's point of view, not only do they agree, they also can't really add that much. We are watching from the sidelines as these world events take place. And for Labour, there is almost nothing they can do, except, as Lisa Nandy said, there's not much we can do, but what the government is doing is probably the right thing.
No, I totally agree. I don't think Labour can do anything about this. I think what's really, really interesting about the mutiny is that Putin is he's invaded Ukraine. This is all dreadful. But the Wagner group, Prigozhin, he's not exactly a good man. He runs a band of thugs. A lot of them are convicts who were liberated from jails in Russia to go and fight in Ukraine. They've been accused of all sorts of human rights abuses. These aren't necessarily people we want with nuclear, to have power over nuclear weapons. So the position here is probably that, your enemy's enemy is, maybe this is good from the standpoint that there are problems in Russia, but you can't support either side. Both sides are not great.
All right. OK, fair enough. Let's see. This is politics, so let's see if we can have an heated row now. Let's go to domestic politics. I put it to John Glen, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, that tax cuts look incredibly unlikely given the efforts to bring inflation down, or under control at least, with rising interest rates.
Basically, we shut down the economy. We spent a lot of money. When we came out of COVID, we had a lot of debt interest to pay. That has gone up because interest rates have gone up, and that makes our public finances very challenging. Two significant, once in 100 years and once in several generation events of war in Europe. The government is here to deal with whatever circumstances are happening, and we are taking the right decisions at a difficult time, as the IMF indeed endorsed in their recent assessment of the UK economy.
Claire, I am getting on, but I don't think I heard anything that sounded like a plan or even an idea about bringing inflation down there.
I think this is the real trouble, that the sort of underlying price rises, the government can't really do much about. You have Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, trying to, say that he's bringing in the banks, he's speaking to regulators, he's speaking to supermarkets about prices. But in real terms, there's not much the government can really do. And the public is punishing the government for this. Labour are doing really, really well in the polls. And Rishi Sunak is, a former Chancellor and a man who should know about the economy. I don't think the public are getting the reassurance that they need from the government. And, the fact is that this will be, John Glen has the position that, that we can't talk about tax rises yet. But if the Tories want to win the next election, I think they're going to have to do something. But while inflation is this high, their hands are tied, and there really isn't much comfort they can offer to homeowners or to voters.
We're hearing that the Prime Minister has advised homeowners to hold their nerve over mortgage interest rates. How's your nerves, Peter?
My nerves, like most of the rest of the nation, are slightly fraught at the moment. If I was to go to my bank and say, no, it's fine, I feel very relaxed about this, I'm sure they'll be fine. So I think that John Glen interview, I think if I was a Conservative MP watching that, I would be simultaneously quite miserable, and I would have thought it was nothing unexpected. Because the whole thing is that Conservative MPs, who even a few months ago could privately say they could foresee this kind of landing zone where even not an election win, but a hung parliament could take place. The closer the election gets, the tinier and tinier that zone gets, and the more the options are being closed off. And it makes sense for him to effectively rule out tax cuts. We had the Liz Truss experiment of doing tax cuts when the public finances were not in a great state, and interest rate rises means they're even tougher now. Okay. And so it'd be politically very, very fraught. But then the biggest problem is that we've had high inflation rates, so people are already feeling much, much poorer. Indeed. And then suddenly this is going to come. And the question that everybody asks before a general election is, do I feel, financially better off than I did last time around? And the answer for most people is going to be no. Well, one part of the answer might be pay, which we will talk about after the break.
It's actually really important for us to be looking at these images and to understand what's happening. So as we saw last week, this shipwreck was something that Greek authorities were actually knew about pre-happening. So what's really important is to understand that these deaths were really our fault and is something that could have been avoidable.
They were preventable.
Exactly, they were really unavoidable. And for us to be able to recognize that we are responsible for these deaths, I think is really crucial. And until we're not able, both in Greece, the rest of Europe and the UK, to offer safe legal routes for people to get here is something that I've talked about in this book that is getting published this week.
As someone who came from Greece himself, I have to say, unfortunately, because there isn't any safe routes, people are taking, these horrible journeys to come to the UK or reach to a safe country. But and everyone is like, oh, why you are doing these kind of things? But because there isn't any safe route, So I guess if the governments can help people to open a safe route so they can follow that that route to come to the UK instead of taking these journeys. Otherwise, many people are going to die. Like we had around 80 people who have lost their life just 3 days ago, or like few months ago when I think the ship was drowned in Italy, and many people have died again. Not long ago in France again, on the way to the UK.
I started this book because of my frustration with a lot of mainstream media and politicians and the way that they scapegoat a lot of refugees and asylum seekers and also represent them as, villains. We know the stereotypes of people invading our borders, invading our countries, and not really looking at people as humans and recognizing that, as you will see in the book, everyone has a different journey, like Ali has just shared with us, different stories, and being able to recognize that these are people seeking safety is a way to then be able to, I hope, to have empathy and care for people once they do get here. And this variety of stories is shown in these posters and these conversations and really makes us look at the issue in a much more wholehearted way, I hope.
Welcome back to Sophy Ridge on Sunday, The Take, where we take you through some of the analysis of the morning's interviews. I asked the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, John Glen, if the Prime Minister was planning to overrule the independent pay review bodies for the next round of public sector pay awards.
No, what happens is we have the reports of the pay review bodies. Most of those have come in. And then we look at those and make an assessment. Now, obviously, in some of the disputes we've had in recent months, they're near to resolution. We've obviously very pleased that several of the NHS unions have agreed the agenda for change deal, 5% and then 4%, and some different changes across working practices. And we will look at those pay review body reports, and that will be the Prime Minister and the Chancellor working together with input from me on what the right way of resolving this is.
With me are Claire Ellicott, the Mail on Sunday's acting deputy political editor, and Peter Walker, acting deputy political editor for The Guardian. Claire, they are backing off the support for the independent pay review because they kept saying before, leave it, we're going to support the pay review bodies. Suddenly, not so sure.
No, it does feel like that. So John Glen is clearly not making any promises. We've got the pay review bodies expected to say that a lot of public sector workers are going to be in line for 6% pay rises, and it looks like the government are going to argue this would be inflationary. Inflation's a big problem. We need to get it down, and so therefore we can't accept these recommendations. They'll almost certainly argue that they came out before we found out that inflation's stickier than the government and a lot of experts had thought and is not moving. But it will be very little comfort to public sector workers who think they do need a pay rise. And we've been, over the past year, we've just seen strike after strike after strike. They will be emboldened to do this more. And, the government is in a bit of a bind because they have said that, we are going to follow these recommendations, that, that was their way of kind of trying to take the political heat out of this row. But now, if they oppose that, it does look it looks very shaky of them to do that.
Well, hold that thought for a moment. Let's see if we got anything different from Lisa Nandy for the opposition.
If we were in government right now, we would be asking the pay review bodies to give far more weight to the recruitment and retention crisis in the recommendations that we make. We take seriously their recommendations, but we wouldn't be bound for them. Ultimately, we'd be seeking a far more constructive relationship with our trade unions and our frontline workforce so that we could negotiate our way through what is a very, very difficult situation. not just in addressing the issues around pay for frontline workers, but also addressing the issues around working conditions. In the NHS, for example, it's one of the major challenges and one of the major reasons that people tell us that they're leaving is because they just cannot see light at the end of the tunnel. They're so overworked, as well as struggling to put food on the table.
Peter, the tone is a little bit different. You know, we'll work with unions, but basically she's also saying that we're not going to commit to supporting the pay review recommendations.
She was, but the fact that she's making reference to recruitment and retention of staff, I think, is a big kind of key element to it, which is making the point that, you know, you can try and push down pay as much as you want. And, I mean, for the government, it's almost the definition of a government that is in trouble or is in kind of difficulties, that whatever option they pick, there's no easy way around because they've tied themselves to this mast of halving inflation by the end of the year. So they have to devote everything towards that. But voters don't only judge a government by whether they meet this kind of target they've given. They also judge them a lot on whether things work. And if things are going on, people are going on strike all the time and services are getting worse and worse, then they judge them by that too. And if you're a public sector worker when inflation is currently well above 6%, saying not only can you not have 6%, you have to have less than that, then you would imagine the chances are more teachers or doctors, whoever, will leave and go to other jobs or will hold strike action. And it gets into this situation where people think the country just isn't working very well. And with Lisa Nandy, I think it's interesting. Seemed to me, it felt like she was hinting that she would want to give them what they would. You know, whether you'd been interviewing Rachel Reeves, if she'd given a slightly different answer, you know, only time will tell. And it's a tricky one for Labour because they have this very, very kind of strong imperative not to be seen as fiscally likely to spend too much money, but they have to keep the unions on side too.
Claire, 10 seconds. Do you think Mr Sunak's actually inspiring any confidence yet?
I think it's a real problem for them. I think the Tories want to, you know, the economy to get better in the run-up to the next election. They're hoping that inflation reduces so that they have something to offer voters, but it is looking very, very shaky at the moment.
OK, well, later today, the Sophy Ridge On Sunday podcast will have the best of our interviews discussed by myself, the political communications advisor Laura Emily Dunn, and our programme editor Scott Beasley. You can listen to that a little later on today on the Sky News app, or if you scan the QR code on your screen now, you can subscribe for free wherever you get your podcast. Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Peter. That's it from Sophy Ridge On Sunday, The Take this morning. And by the way, 9 o'clock tonight, watch our Windrush documentary. Bye.